Throughout the history of the Overwatch League, every single year there's those couple of guys where you can't help but feel bad for them. Those guys who are just stuck in unfortunate situations, whether it's because the org is showing incompetence or because the team simply sucks and they just can't get out of there. And looking back at it, you just feel for some of these guys as their potential gets completely wasted despite their best efforts to carry a sorry team. For some guys, it's one painful year before either calling it quits or going somewhere else, while for others, they choose to stick with a specific franchise for years on end just for the same exact result to keep on happening. In today's video, we're going to take some time to talk about some of these players' stories and appreciate the efforts they put in despite being in a not so great situation. Here's a list of 5 players that fans felt bad for being in terrible situations. And the first guy we're going to take a look at is Effect from the 2018 Dallas Fuel. Coming into that season, the Dallas Fuel were expected to be a title contender, if not in the playoff race. They were a very strong team made up of the Envious Core, amongst other famous players, and at the helm of it all was Effect. He was expected to be a leader through his gameplay after showing exemplary skills on DPS during the Apex days on Envious. And needless to say, at the start, despite Dallas being up and down, he showed a lot of skill, making huge plays throughout every single match in the early stages for Dallas. He consistently found kills and put the team on his back regardless of the hero he was playing, especially showing some exemplary skills on hitscan and arguably being a top 5 tracer player in the league. Just from watching the gameplay, he was everything that was advertised. He was a superstar for the Dallas Fuel, but unfortunately, early on Dallas were losing a lot of games, and that led to a loss in confidence, amongst other big-time problems with tank drama, constantly rotating certain pieces in and out of the lineup, Taimu dealing with burnout, coaching incompetence, amongst a lot of other things. Every corner you turned, there was some kind of drama involving the Dallas Fuel, and in spite of that, Effect just kept trying and trying and trying, all for naught, as by the time Stage 3 ended, the Dallas Fuel were 6-24. And by the time Stage 4 came, he was completely exhausted and burnt out to the point of no return. He couldn't do it anymore. He got so exhausted from trying to carry this Dallas team that he had to stop playing for the rest of the season. Effect had one of the most extreme training regimens you've ever seen. He was one of the best DPS players in the world, and Dallas completely wasted his talents. Now, he wasn't the greatest teammate in the world, and he even admits to that, but it's not exactly his fault that the team around him just crumbled at every single point imaginable throughout the year. And you'd only have to think what could have happened if Effect had played for a better team in 2018. Under different circumstances, maybe his efforts would have been of greater use to a team like the Seoul Dynasty, who almost made the playoffs. But 1 year of frustration doesn't even begin to compare to the 3 that alexyOWL faced. Choi might have been in the most unfortunate situation in Overwatch League history. alexyOWL started his career with the Charge in 2021. It didn't seem like a lot of teams were interested in his talents at the time, but he had a chance to maybe prove himself and climb up the ladder in his first year on the Guangzhou Charge. Now, unfortunately, this Charge team was in a rebuilding phase, and their roster was one of the worst in the league, so expectations were very low. In spite of that, he still did put up a good rookie season where he showed a lot of promise, and there was something to build upon there if the Charge could just upgrade their roster a little bit. But unfortunately for Choi and all his fans worldwide, that day just never came, at least not consistently. There were so many years of either a bad start and a good finish that came too late, or the opposite. Everything just couldn't click for alexyOWL's tenure on the Charge. Something always seemed to go wrong at the most inopportune time. The Guangzhou Charge's incompetence after the 2020 season directly impacted what his career could have been if he was on a better team. Choi decided to stick it out with the Charge for all those years, and in return, he got absolutely nothing. He got no chances whatsoever to show off his talents to a worldwide audience, only able to show his skills to anyone who was willing to show APAC, as the Charge not once in his career qualified for an international tournament. Can you imagine dedicating 3 years to this team just to be treated like that? That's half of the league's existence right there. It was heartbreak year after year despite him being one of the best DPS out there, and by the time 2023 was about to come to an end, they released him as they decided to go in a different direction, but even in that scenario, they screwed him over, as it was just too deep into the season for anybody to willingly sign this guy to their roster. Had they done it earlier, maybe there's a chance he could have played somewhere else, but because of the timing, the charge only further screwed over what could have been a magnificent career, and I think that most Overwatch League fans out there will agree that the Chargers' incompetence led to maybe one of the biggest what-ifs in Overwatch League history. But ChoiceA1 ain't the only guy that suffered for a long period of time. The OG, and maybe the king of it, is Dante. Dante had a very respectable career. You can't argue with the longevity and the money he's made, and some of the great moments he's had with specific teams. Nobody's going to deny that. Dante's one of the best Western players ever. But what you need to keep in mind is that Dante was in the league for almost its entire existence, and in that span, he was on some terrible teams that could not make use of his talents for 2/3 of his career. I mean, Dante was part of some awful teams, and in other situations, just being misused completely, or being forced to change his position like we'd see in later seasons. It starts with the San Francisco Shock, the inaugural season. This team is trying to figure it out and build around some young pieces. A bunch of their guys aren't really on the stage yet at the beginning, and Dante's mostly just a filler piece who ends up being trade bait despite having a really good rookie year. And just remember, the Shock 1 year later would win the championship. He could have been a part of an Overwatch League dynasty if they decided that he had a place on that team. Even though he did so well, they still just thought he had no place and he wasn't part of the future, so they trade him to Houston. And in the first 2 seasons, they were consistently like a bottom 5 or worse team in the league, in spite of his best efforts on his signature Sombra and Tracer, and putting up so many massive carry performances. The Outlaws were freaking terrible. They never could build a good team around him. Management at first was completely incompetent, refusing to sign a lot of Korean players or being all that invested in contenders' talent. And then from there, just having these terrible teams with tank issues and support issues, and never having that consistent lineup around him to give him the help he needed. It wasn't until his later seasons that the Outlaws finally started to figure it out and give him the career that he deserved by finishing top 3 in the Overwatch League playoffs in 2022. But sadly, after that, kind of like with the Shock, they felt there was no use for him, and the Outlaws end up peaking after he leaves the team in 2023, and he's forced to settle for a job with the LA Gladiators. No one really wants him. He's basically swapped over to tank at this point, which could have changed his career trajectory if he stayed on DPS maybe. Then the Gladiators decide that he's the problem as well. It felt like nobody wanted him. The Glads released him mid-season when they were doing decently. They suck the rest of the way through, and that's the end of Dante's Overwatch League career. No championships, no tournament wins, no nothing. Just a bunch of teams that misused his talent and then threw him away like trash. And throughout his 6-year career, he was almost always a consistent player and a good piece that you could rely on. It really makes you wonder what could have happened if the Shock decided to hold on to him, or if he got traded to a different team that wasn't the Outlaws back in the day. Even though Dante still had a pretty decent career, one can only think how much better it could have been if a few more things end up going his way. Speaking of wishing things could have gone differently for a player, next up we have Saya player. Saya is one of the prime and OG examples of what it looks like to be in such an unfortunate situation. He ended up on some of the worst teams in Overwatch League history when deciding to sign a contract with the Florida Mayhem mid-2018. And it's really unfortunate too, because Saya player could have been a very special guy, as he was a very exciting prospect coming out of Apex on Meta Athena. He played alongside Libero. It was really exciting to see him join the league mid-season to help out a Florida team that desperately needed some more talent, but the moment he signed that dotted line to join a Florida team that was being heavily mismanaged at the time, his fate was sealed. And that's a damn shame, because the moment he joined Florida, he was like an explosion of excitement. He brought so much energy to this Florida team and made them worth watching when he was in the game. They were already screwed as everyone was burnt out and there was drama left, right, and center, but he was still putting up some massive superstar-like performances performances as arguably the best Widow duelist in the league, even being able to keep up with the likes of Pine and Carpe despite being on significantly worse teams. If you go back and watch the tape, even to this day, Sayaplayer has some of the greatest carry performances on snipers in the game's history on these Florida Mayhem teams. And it was all for nothing, as in 2 seasons, in his first 2 years there, they won a combined 13 games. They never once made a push for any type of tournament for Saya to show off his talents in, and the only time they were remotely competitive when he was interested in playing was a meaningless 4-3 stage in 2019. Specifically 2018 though, it felt like a lot of his Widow performances were heavily wasted in a Widow-centric meta, and I can only imagine how his career could have turned out if he played on a real team that season. Like, imagine if Boston, for example, signed him mid-season. That could have made a crazy difference, and we could have been talking about him in a completely different light. Instead, the thing that Saya's the most known for is playing on that silly meme team with their player driving the bus. I mean, afterwards, think about it. Think about what the rest of his career was like. In 2019, him, like many other hitscan players, were screwed over in GOATs. He wasn't very good at that. He only got a brief moment to shine in 2019. And then, by the end of that, when 2020 came around, he was ready to call it a career. He decided that he wanted to pursue professional Valorant mid-season, and he no longer had a place on Florida when they had finally turned things around. We got robbed of Sayaplayer maybe being one of the most transcendent talents of the early years of the Overwatch League. If he had been on a different team, just imagine how much differently we could have been looking at history as he carries in a map 5 against a big team, or gets the opportunity to make a difference in a tournament game. We never got to see that version of Sayaplayer, and it's a damn shame. And before we get into the 5 spot, I wanted to give a quick honorable mention to Rack Attack and Dove, as these two absolutely went through the ringer on the Vegas Eternal, and I wouldn't wish what they went through upon my worst enemies. As for the real official number 5 spot, I'm going with Hisu, another classic that everybody typically feels pretty bad for. Most people would argue for a majority of his career, if not all of it, he was an above average DPS player, and in some people's eyes, a star in the making. And yet, there were very few opportunities for him to show off his talents on a good team and make a serious run at something. The closest he got was in his rookie year on the Philly Fusion, and in that year, he was mostly a rotational piece, trying to prove himself, getting some playtime here and there in some big tournaments, but never seeing the stage consistently. Deep down, Hisu knew that there was no way he was going to start consistently on the Fusion. This was Carpe's team, that wasn't going to change, so he had to go elsewhere if he wanted to be a full-time starter. So that's what he does. He goes over to the Toronto Defiant in 2021, and from there he basically sealed his death wish of being on mediocre teams in maybe one of the most poorly run franchises for the next 2 years. In spite of the team always seemingly trying to do everything in their power to get in his way, he still had some pretty good years for the Toronto Defiant. In fact, I'd argue that because of him, they were able to heavily raise their ceiling. They went 9-7 his first season there, which is slightly above average, I guess, and on top of it, they ended up making the playoffs and getting top 3 in the Summer Showdown in 2022. All things considered, he had a pretty decent career over there. However, in the grand scheme of it, seeing how hard he carried compared to some of his other teammates that were complete detriments, you just know that he could have done even more if he was in a better spot. How many times did he have to completely put the team on his back with some unreal Sombra and Sojourn and Ashe performances just to stay afloat? He had consistent mediocre play at flex DPS a lot of the time, and not to mention a revolving door around him, as in typical Toronto Defiant fashion, they completely overhauled their roster compared from one season to the next. And that's not even including the issues with coaching changes consistently, or the fact that some players supposedly didn't want to play or get traded, amongst other guys just not showing up when Hisu really needed them to, potentially costing them tournament and even playoff matches. For his entire time on Toronto, it never felt like they were sure of themselves. They were always changing their minds about things, and it led to a situation where he was just never going to achieve his full potential. And by the time his tenure on Toronto ended, he was already past his prime. The opportunity to play for a contending team had already passed. No one really wanted to sign him, so he had to settle for the Shanghai Dragons, who were arguably the worst team in APAC in 2023. I mean, they had freaking Fleta starting at tank, and at one point they almost had Diem as their support player. This is the kind of stuff that he was dealing with. That was the only job opportunity lined up for this guy. Do you know how sad that is to see his career wasted? He seemed like he was such a great up-and-coming player in 2020, this hit-scan sensation out of Runaway that could have been a difference maker, who showed good looks even with minimal playtime on Philly in big tournament and playoff matches, but no one wanted to give him that shot that he rightfully deserved, so he always had to settle for things that just weren't actually worth his time. That is what Hisu's legacy is going to be, and that absolutely breaks my heart. And that, my friends, is the end of our video. Those are 5 players throughout the history of the Overwatch League that were in absolutely terrible situations that definitely deserved better. Let me know what you think about this down in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Make sure to leave some other players if I missed any. And if you want to see a part 2 to this, definitely let me know, as there's a bunch of other players that I'd love to get to and give them the respect they deserve. And of course, if you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a like and subscribe to the channel if you're new. I would appreciate it a lot. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time.